So our next speaker this morning is Brian Arnall. And Brian Arnall comes to us from Oklahoma State University. Just as a note too, we have full bios. If you go online, you'll be able to find a kind of more detailed program that's available online so that you can read up a little bit more about all of our speakers today. But Dr. Arnall works in extension, teaching, and research, and is going to be talking us today about some of these kind of weeding out the ideas of looking at this different type of technology and some of the scientific efforts that are going into determining how effective they are. But we do want to also point out something that's not in the bio online, is that he was recently recognized as a fellow of the American Society of Agronomy. So congratulations on that and welcome here this morning.
All right. I mean, how could I not come to Canada in December? I mean, really, right? Leave Oklahoma. So really excited to have this opportunity, and we're going to kind of work through some thought processes about weeding out technologies. I've got kind of 3 examples of how I process it. I'd like to add though to Todd's and the data question, because that's something I deal with daily is data. How many of you have JD Link or one of the apps for the companies, right? The Bears app, Syngenta app, any app? That's you basically you accept that app and you're accepting the right for the data to be utilized. It's just in part of the processes. I mean, why do you get something for free? You get something for free because there is value in it for somebody downstream. So a little bit about my role at Oklahoma State is extension specialist. I do extension, I do teaching, I do research. Background is soil fertility. Trained with engineers, so half of my committee was engineers, half were agronomists, so a lot of sensor technology development, early development, R&D, releasing, and my day-to-day now is talking about drones, about AI, about nitrogen and phosphorus variable rate, and also telling farmers why nitrogen is good. We're telling the public why nitrogen is good, or why grandma needs to put some iron on her tomato plants, something like that. So that's my day-to-day. And going through this, and by the way, Tammy, John didn't share with me the questions or the topics. He just told me what to talk about. So the whole slide that you had, that's all new news to me. This is what I'm getting to. The line of folks knocking on your doors, wanting to sell, I use the term, it might be a Southern term, but peddle something at your doorstep for you to buy is never ending, right? I mean, there's always something new. And even more so, and I think Todd alluded to this, is it's not the salesmen aren't just now the mom and pops or the fly by night. It's the big people, the big dogs that have the money that are now getting into the technologies. It's the Syngentas, it's the big folks. So the line is never ending. So this is a conversation. I don't have data necessarily. I want to have a conversation about how to process technology and things, and I'll go through some examples. And understand, and this is a real thing that happens, is that often marketing is outpacing R&D, or maybe I should say marketing gets to go out with something before R&D specialists are really ready for it to hit the place. And Todd makes a great example. The Farmer's Edge movement, what was done in Canada was amazing, but the progression outside was probably a little bit too fast, dropping right into Mississippi. I spent a lot of time in Mississippi. It's not like Canada. I don't know if you know that. Neither the crops or the people. I'm just going to say that much. And so what you get, and it is highly valuable. It is highly important for this technology to have real world learning. But a lot of the times the stuff is coming out a little bit too soon. These companies are just kind of checking themselves by putting out a lot of products on a portfolio to see which one will survive or which one won't. And so, it's a great learning process that, yeah, that's how we vet things. But there's going to be things that hit the marketplace that, really aren't expected to survive that long. They're just seeing if it's a golden flash. And the big change in the industry that we're seeing in agriculture, as Todd already mentioned, the thought process of tech coming to market 15 years ago in agriculture versus now changes when the venture capitalists come in. There's a different point when you have that kind of money. The point is, what we often see is, can we hit that golden goose and sell it rapidly? You know, a lot of folks don't build something because they want to retire within it. They build it to then liquidate it and move on to the next, right? And that's not necessarily new, but the rate and the magnitude of money is new. So here's how I take it. I'm an agronomist, I'm a soil scientist, and here's how I process all things. It's a mechanistic approach. I look at things as a mechanism. And I'm going to tell you as we go through, you're not expected to know the mechanisms. You're not expected to know the scientist or the science as a CCAs, as the agronomist. But what you should know is the community around you of who does get a specialized science, who does get a specialized topic. Know the John Herds of the area, to know who you need to go talk to, the Don Flaytons. Go know those so that you can call, because there's too much out there. The breadth of what's coming onto the marketplace is just too great and too broad for anyone to be able to just kind of weed out all of it. So you've got to have those trusted relationships, those people that you can call upon, and also know that at some point you're probably going to be one of those. And so I'll walk through the things that I have more experience in, and how I mechanistically walk through the processes. Okay, so this is more of a procedural a frame of thought of how I address things. And if there's time, we might even throw some on the board and I'll break it. And by the way, I will anger somebody, and it's okay. I'm like the grandparent that comes in and gives the grandchildren sugar, then leaves. Okay. This is the most recurring theme that I have seen overarching in all things we're doing in agriculture. It's the process of correlation. This is correlated. This is correlated. And an immediate step, and it's not a step, it's a leap. And it's a leap from like Earth to moon sometimes. Causation. Just because things are correlated does not mean there's causation within there. And one of the easiest ways that marketing can be done is you provide correlation analysis. You provide, we did this and we saw this. We're in a special system. The medical field is very, very tight. The engineering field is very tight. The stringent values and everything that's happening, just the science that goes into making concrete is intense, and the variables that they control. And then you go into the farm. How many things affect your yield? 1, 100, thousands? And are those things consistent across fields and years and days and months and hours? No. And so the amount of variables that come into our segment make a lot of the tech adoption more challenging. That's why taking something that was developed in one location and rapidly moving it to the other, that's where we get failure points. My job at Oklahoma State, I've always said, is I take stuff out of the Corn Belt, because Todd's right. Things are not made for wheat. They're not made for the Plain States, period. My goal is to take stuff developed in the Corn Belt and find ways to adopt it and make it work for the Plain States, right? Because there's a price point, there's an application point, and there's an environmental point. And a lot of things that work beautifully in the middle of Indiana sometimes fail in the plains. And I'm talking plains from Texas to Canada, because the plains are all the same. We're either too cold, too dry, too wet, too long, too short, too something or other. And I love talking to my Corn Belt friends that they're very upset because they're in the middle of the season and it hasn't rained in 7 days. I'm like, crap, it's been 70 since we've had a rainfall event. So, the magnitude of what happens is different. So let's get down in the nuts and bolts. This comes from, I got to look down. I can't see it. Mixingbowlhub.com. You should look. It's a really cool group. This is the 2023 Ag Biological Landscape. That's not products. That's companies. This landscape is special. Very, very special. That's all I can say. I've known some good friends. I've been around long enough where I do have the gray hairs from grads that I've got friends that are now in the corporate world that are lead agronomists for corporations. And a year ago, I talked to a good close friend, and I was talking about biologicals, and he basically told me that his ownership group informed him they would find a biological for the portfolio. He would find a biological for the portfolio, whether it worked or not, because if not, he wouldn't have a job. because their company at the time didn't have anything for their portfolio and they must have. And I'm not talking a little company, I'm talking an international group. And so you're talking to an agronomist who's very scientific. He wants to know what's going on. Bosses are saying, we need a label for our portfolio, the end. So how do you go through this? And so this is my walkthrough. This is how we walk through that. And this is the simplistic approach that Arnall will take. I break down to the functions. If we want to talk about the biologicals, what are the functions and what value can they add to you? And so this is my generic group. If you talk to a microbiologist, they will shun me for simplifying it to this point. But let's just keep it simple here. So the nitrogen 2 fixers, that would be the proven 40, the Utrisha, many of those. We'll talk about that. The symbiotes, the OM decomposers, plant nutrient mineralizers, nutrient solubilizers, plant hormones, and enzymes. I'm just going to kind of walk down each of these and tell you what I would say is their function and their method, because this is what you have to understand if they're selling it to you. One, the nitrogen fixers. What do? They fix atmospheric nitrogen. When is fixing atmospheric nitrogen important? When you under-fertilize. If you over-fertilize, these have zero value. If you are putting on, do you want to go metric, so kilo? If you're putting on 200 kilo per hectare and your crop needs 100, you do not need a nitrogen fixer. The end. They will work if you under-apply or if you manage your nitrogen. If you're putting everything up front, there is some cause to say, okay, I could put on an N fixer as a safety mechanism because maybe I'm going to lose it all in a heavy rainfall. There's been some conversation on that. It sometimes works. But go back and say, if you're over managing your nitrogen because it's your risk aversion technique, that's the way you're managing risk, is you apply more nitrogen and walk away from the environmental and sociological and ecological aspects of over applying nitrogen. Just that risk management aversion. N2 fixers probably not your gig. By the way, I can promise you, I can put something in your sprayer. Well, let's not say you. I don't know you well enough. So come down south to the folks I work with. I can put something in your sprayer and you can reduce your rate by 25 kilo per hectare, and I promise you won't drop yield. 75% of the time. And it's all I need. If I have 75% wind, that is, I dropped you 25 pounds, 25 kilos, and you didn't change any yields. I won 75% of the time. This product is amazing. Because science has really shown that you're probably plus or minus 40 already. And so 25 is a safe number. I've worked with a lot of these companies and they blacklist me because I refuse to put out their product at less than 25. I go at, less than 85% kind of. I go at the low level. That's where it has to be tested at. You guys see. Symbiotes. This is kind of intriguing for me. So the symbiotics are out there. This is all the AMF or the AM fungi. These are the things that are creating a relationship with the plants that will extend and grab water and grab nutrients. That concept is really good. I like that concept. Note the concept. The challenge that we get, at least in my environment, I'm going to say yours is the same, is that the prairie states are fascinating because our soils are not the best, and our current biologicals or biology is built off of really crappy weather. They are tough. I've talked to a lot of our biologists in the prairie states, and they'll say, you know what? Our microbial and fungi population are pretty competitive. And if you bring something in from Indiana, it just might whoop the crap out of it. It has to be competitive against the native. Let me ask you this. Do you want to add something that's competitive against the native? Is that called down south kudzu, Sericea lespedeza, multiflora rose? Oh, all the invasives that the Natural Resource Conservation Service brought into the states because it was good for soil bank stabilization. Anybody, what's the conversation about GM crops? Is that worldwide accepted? Everybody loves GM crops. Why are we okay with GM things in the soil? Because that's where we're at. We're genetically modifying fungi and bacteria to put it in the soil. That's okay. I'm not sure I'm on board with that. But the symbiotes, I think it's a great potential, but we have to there's probably very regional specific when it comes to where they'll work. OM decomposers. This is something that the Corn Belt loves, and it's great. I'll talk to the soil scientist after he takes this picture here. John, what's the average organic matter for the region here in West?
3.7%.
Okay, and West all the way through Canada.
But very bit about.
Okay, so 3. In my area, it's 2 is really good, 1 is pretty average. So where they develop a lot of these, organic matters 4, 5, and 6. If you read a label that says releases nutrients in the soil, I'm going to bank money that 90% of it will be something, a biological that is degrading organic or breaking down, mineralizing organic matter. In some environments, that's just fine. In mine, it's not. I don't want to break down my 1% more than it's already breaking down. And so you've got to think, is your environment one that's conducive in breaking down or actually speeding up the process of mineralization, which mineralization is a beautiful natural process that as the soil's warm and the moisture increases, mineralization speeds up, which happens is match crop growth pretty closely. And so what we're trying to speed up that process. It may not actually set with the crop growth model. So does the organic matter decomposers work for you? Mineralizers and solubilizers, these are things that are actually breaking chemical bonds, and they can do it. There's a product out there that's supposed to release phosphorus from calcium bonds. It's a really neat process, and I think it has great application in areas that have historic animal manure waste because you have that buildup of phosphorus. Let's release it. But the 3 people I've talked to that use it have never applied animal waste, and their phosphorus values are like 3 ppm. So now they're mining an already depleted, and it's not used in the right environment. They're not helping the system. They're just slowly mineralizing, solubilizing what they have. Plant hormones. These are pretty good. I do think there's a lot of ability in this. So if we look at some of the stuff we're adding, there is some question, are we adding enough to impact the plant hormones and enzymes? Just understand what function, and does that function actually help you? You know, some people, I read an advertisement to my class the other day. It said, slow down your crop growth so it's more competitive against weeds. I don't get that. But I'm not a weed scientist, so maybe a weed scientist can tell me why slowing the crop growth makes it more competitive against the weeds. But just know what you're getting into. Step 2, so now we go into the other aspects. Soil sensors. I've run all these. These are things I've had. One of them is mine, the Varus unit's mine. I've got Soil Optrix. I've had GeoProspector, or vice versa. I don't remember. I've run them all. I've done them all. The thought process on it, here's the deal. We're measuring soil properties that impact crop production. And we understand that. Is that okay? What properties impact our crop production the most? And is it consistent? Is it the same property? How many properties? Is it the same property each year? What's the importance of the property that we're looking at in magnitude of orders of other properties? And see where I'm going with this train of thought. And another better question is, it's fascinating to me, is how are we actually using the knowledge to benefit us, or are we just making pretty maps? And then just drawing linear lines. One of the things I see most often is a pretty map and a linear line, meaning a straight line between low and high, and we draw points in between and say, this is what we're going to do. Biological sciences speaking, linear lines don't happen often. It's not straight lines. We'll dig in. There's another slide for that later. Okay, so this is one we'll hit. The Varus, they're made out of Kansas, so I can hit those guys. I know them quite well. It's soil textural maps. EC, effective way to map soil texture. It works amazingly well to map soil texture. It also has soil water, which, texture is, related to soil water holding capacity. Salt, it does catch salt, so we use it for salt spots. So I'm going to ask you, how many things, if you've been to a soil science course, how many things in the system can texture impact? All the way to all the way to herbicide rate. And so how are you implementing that, and how consistent is it, and what are you doing? To what magnitude is texture impacting you? So I should not take anything I do with texture and apply it to Winnipeg soils. because it's not the same. The implication of a textural change to me would be different than it would be for you. Impacts, it's all about how we use the knowledge. So these tools are really good tools, and I want to mention again later, but we're getting a tool out there and using as a broad scope measure the same way instead of putting some regional agronomic thought process to it and actually tweaking it to the environment. It's too easy to say, I'm going to buy one of these, I'm going to do what the company says, and this is what's going to be doing because I can charge $10 a hectare and rock and roll with it. Now let's talk a little bit water holding. These are all the things we spoke of: yield potential, nutrient use efficiency. By the way, if texture impacts all these, how are you adjusting your maps? Are you adjusting all your nutrient maps? Are you adjusting your seeding map? Are you adjusting your hybrid what maps into what magnitude?
Is for zoning for variable rate.
Zoning for variable rate. Okay, so if it's zoning for variable rate, that tells me then texture has to be the biggest driver of the field, and no other thing is a driver. What if slope's the driver, or aspect, or organic matter, or so the point is that when we zone based upon a technology, we're saying, or a thing, it could be yield. You could zone with yield maps. You're saying then nutrient uptake and removal is the biggest driver of the field. That's what you're addressing. So again, how are we going to use it to drive decisions? And are those decisions accurate? And I want to say, the same thing. So we run the Varus across a lot of acres, and it only has value in about a third of them because we may not have surface textural changes. The changes come at a depth with the sensor not picking up. I might have 5 soil series, but they're all silt loams in the surface. So the difference is slope or depth to limiting layer, or clay increase, or carbonate at lower surface, or sodium at lower surface, or something that the sensors won't pick up. So I have a map that has a beautiful color range, but it goes from 10 to 12. But I can get 4 zones out of that 10 to 12, John. Heck, I can get 20 zones out of it if I wanted to, right? And so is that really changing? And I'll go back to or do we know? This is a better question. Do you know what your Liebig's law of the minimum is for each field, each season, each location? Sensors for soil testing. So this is another one. As mentioned in Chriselle's lab. This is, poking sensor in, taking a look at it. And I want to say this is old tech. I saw this in Sao Paulo in 2014, I think, 2015. I don't remember when I went. So this is Spec Solo, a library of soils where they bring a soil sample in, dried, ground, homogenized, and they look at it with NIR, and they get a reflectance, and they say, this is how many nutrients they have. At the time, they had 1 million samples from the state of Sao Paulo. That was their library that they correlated back to. They could not leave the state because the technology failed because their library was focused on the state of Sao Paulo. They could not go to Mato Grosso. They could not go to the Minas Gerais. It was just, they were located there. The library was not inclusive. Let's think about this. You're getting light hitting and light refracting and reflecting off of the soil. That's what you're measuring. Do you think soil moisture, we'll get into that. I don't even go there. How about, is it a calcitic based? Is it calcium based? Is it aluminum based? Is it an iron based? Is it an organic matter based? Is it what? All those things are going to change the spectrum, and therefore the library must be comprehensive enough to go across multiple regions so that you could incorporate that. We've run the sensors from Canada and Oklahoma, and there's correlation with our numbers, but they're absolutely wrong because they're not libraried or indexed for our mineral or our soils the way they were formed geologically. It's all about the library. So we'll go back to a lot of the stuff. Is your library good enough? You have to start doing it to get the library, though. So is it the chicken or the egg? Who's going to fail? Who's going to win? We keep having enough failures, and those failures keep getting bought until there's a point where, okay, now we have enough wins. Not saying it's a bad tech. I think it's an amazing potential tech. It's got some shortcomings. And I'm going to briefly mention this. If I'm only measuring 2 centimeters of the soil with one of these sensors, what 2 centimeters am I measuring? Is it the top two, the middle two, the bottom two? If I'm no-till or conservation tillage. And if I'm measuring carbon for this, what part of the soil am I measuring carbon? Because, oh, by the way, carbon in no-till and conservation tillage will be focused on the surface and will be depleted. Phosphorus will be focused on the surface. These are numbers and graphs. Know that in no-till, phosphorus, carbon, pH, nutrients stratify. More on the surface, less down below. So if we're using any sensor that is looking at a narrow band, where am I collecting that narrow band and what magnitude did I give value for that? Because if I collect the middle point of any of those soil samples that has nothing, has no relationship with the 0 to 15 centimeter total. Organic matter, move through. I got 15 minutes. I'm trying to go through all my fun stuff here. All right, now we go to my world. I've been doing optical sensors since the 90s. Getting to build them, break them. I can redo boards and I can do all that stuff. So remote imagery, drones, they're all fun. There are a lot of toys, but what are we actually meeting? There's a ton of indices, by the way. And remember, what we're doing with the drone is or an image, satellite, it doesn't matter. We're taking a picture and saying this picture has numbers that are related to something. Let's get there. One thing I want to mention is that if you go with any company that is giving you imagery, it is much like soil testing. And we had this conversation last night. You send a soil to 15 labs across North America. Is the phosphorus same out of every lab? Oh, one, they use different analytes. You might get an Olsen, a Bray, a Malik, some of those weird things in the northeast part of the US. So it's really kind of up to the creator of what you're getting with this imagery, okay? Also, this imagery is not standard. I worked with sensors that emit light and read light. So my focus was a very narrow bandwidth within the whole spectrum. And some of these things have, so my bandwidth was 7 to 10 nanometers. That's the point of the wavelength I'm looking at. Some of these cameras give you a 50 to 100 nanometer bandwidth for red. That incorporates more than just red. I'm just letting you know that's a fair amount of the spectrum within that. So what are we using it for? One of my best examples, and I think this has been fixed. I hope it has. So here's a picture of a irrigated circle of wheat and a dry land spot of wheat below. This is our high plains. Note in the imagery taken from the plane on the, it would be your left, the irrigated is green. The dry land is brown. It's dead, minus some weeds. There is some weeds out there in a green patch, right? So there's a little spot of kochia that's rocking and rolling. And so I want you to look at the satellite image provided by this. This was a significant significant player at the time. They still are a player, but they don't have the program anymore. Look at the image of the circle. I want you to look down at the bottom, and if you can see it, I can't see it, I apologize. It tells you the percent good, the percent really good, and the percent bad. Look at the numbers, 17.31 acres, 92 acres, and 17.11 acres. Does that seem almost uniform on both sides of the, oh, it's a normalized curve. The data was normalized, so they just did a 10 percentile and said 10% good, 10% low, and the rest is in the middle. That's how they characterized it. It wasn't anything past data. They just said, boom, here you go. And by the way, take a look the same day. Take a look at our dry land crop. This was off the exact same image, same day. It is basically 98% good. It's dead, but it's good. It's good dead. This is where we get into the easy button, folks. If anything you do is an easy button, that means it's not using any regionally specific information, any agronomic. And so they're using a broad scope, a broad reaching algorithm, mechanistic or otherwise. The folks that did this information was just using a normalized model and said, put it across all. Had a company that was really wanting to bring a whole lot of biologicals to the world. So they invested about $2 to $3 million in imagery. And then they sent and sampled another $3 or $4 million based upon the imagery. And they came back and they couldn't find anything. This is Southern Plains. Well, it turns out they looked at imagery and they wanted to go to good areas and bad areas of fields they had access to. And they sampled all these fields and they found out that the bad areas were just salt or drought or clay or something. It wasn't biology. They were going to basically where you had a salt spot and a non-salt spot. You got to have somebody that can look at it and actually process it. Last thing we get through. Let's talk about just data. I'm in nitrogen. Nitrogen is what I've been doing for the best of my career. So let's think about how we look at nitrogen. This goes back to the mechanistic model approach and how you look at folks. So this is a field of corn somewhere in Indiana, because we can't apparently grow corn in Oklahoma, they tell us. So I've got to use Indiana pictures. And so this is NDVI. NDVI is the greenness. How big is the crop? Low NDVI, big NDVI. This is a nitrogen recommendation. Where it's low, I don't put much on. Where it's big, I put a lot of nitrogen on. Does that sound legit? What if we just did it this way? Where it's low, I get a lot of nitrogen. Where it's good, I get less nitrogen. By the way, I can take you to environments where each one of those is correct. In this environment, the low can be brought up. It can make maximum. So I got to load it up. I got to get everything at once. And I draw it down from that point. In this environment, I can't recover. It's where it's at. So I've got to fertilize the current potential, not the future potential. This is also one of them they do. I'll just move through here. There's these models. You go up and you plateau, or you go down and you plateau. This is off the exact same data set. My point is that, oh, here's another one, the back off. This was a Holland. So the same data done in different ways. We can look at it differently. And the deal is every one of these is right somewhere. Every single one of these models has an application, has a fit somewhere, and you have to know it. So this is what we do in Oklahoma. This is our model, where if it's bad, we give up, or if it's kind of medium, we pour the coals to it. And if it looks really good, it's got enough to get to the potential, kind of an average. That's the approach we've taken. But it doesn't fit Virginia. It doesn't fit Mexico in the Yaqui Valley, where it doesn't matter how bad that wheat looks down there in the Yaqui Valley. If you give it nitrogen, it will make 200 bushel. So it's environment. Going back to the mechanistic, if somebody's trying to sell you a model, do you understand how that model is making the recommendations? Do you know how they adapt in, how the Yara, what inputs they're putting in to create the recommendation for you? And is that recommendation a Corn Belt recommendation, or is it a Plains recommendation? Do the inputs of the model actually matter to you in your environment? Move through here. We've done this. Move through slides. Sorry, too many. Oh yeah, this is just a sharing thing. So this is some imagery we pulled from the exact same field from a high drone that cost me like $40,000, which is, the cameras are 30. The drone's a piece of foam that needs JB Weld to repair it. I got JB Weld and tongue depressors as my repair kit, and I've used it often. So, you know, JB Weld goes a long ways. You have JB Weld up here? Fantastic. JB Weld and duct tape. Balin wire. Okay, so we have a high-end drone, we have Sentinel, and then we have Planet satellite, and then we have some active sensors, which I work with. These are corrected using a platform that I have some background with. So this is the high-end drone and the real sensor. Basically right here, we have the two. So high-end drone, a lot of calibration. They look pretty close. I want you to look at the difference of the 0.37 and 0.3 to 0.7, 0.2, 0.8. That's the range between low and high across this field. The important thing is once we get into, here's the Planet Dove, a 0.6 to 0.9 off the same field on the same day, taken within an hour. And remember, the real stuff, the active, what we get with a scientific sensor is 0.2 to 0.8. Let's go to Sentinel, 0.28 to 0.43. All the same day. These are the pictures of the same field, and they're all NDVI. It's the same measure, same field, same day. The values are very different. So what data is being brought in? We have differences. We have challenges with the Sentinel because it's so compressed in its data range. We can't see the differences we really want to see. I don't see the small things I need to see because from a low to high, and by 0.2 is bare soil, 0.8 is pretty good looking wheat. Like it's canopied over kind of wheat. And so the Sentinel is compressed. It makes it a little bit harder to use the data. Implication, I've spent my entire career making growth models using an active sensor that has a repeatability of 0.02 on an 0.005, sorry, on a scale of NDVI, meaning I have a model based upon very specific data. I can't really use SatShot or Sentinel to do my models unless I correct that data. Going back, what are the models that's been implemented and the things that you're applying? Where's that data coming from? How good was the data going into the model? How good is the data that you're feeding into now? Is weather data a significant driver of the model that you're using? How good's your weather data? And I'll go back. Of our nitrogen models, how many of them are using forecasted weather as a nitrogen model component? They all to a degree because it's about mineralization and nitrogen losses. I don't know about what our weathermen and women, but they give us a 10-day, and I think it's laughable that they have a 10-day. These nitrogen models predict out 120 days of weather because of past weather, right? Because past weather is a really good predictor of current weather. We see that every day. So these models are great and they give us an idea of a range, but we got to understand what data is being fed into them. How are we applying them and how are we living and dying off of these models? And I want to bring this back, the easy button. This is something we have to understand. The easy button is accurate. The easy button is soil testing recommendations. I want to tell you that. A soil test for phosphorus and a recommendation is an easy button because how many different recommendations do you have across Canada for wheat? One for, so that's good. Like that's precise because every soil has the exact same response curve, correct, John? Yeah, absolutely. No, soil testing is accurate because I apologize, ladies, because in the 50s and 60s, a bunch of old white dudes had to get on trains and go make a recommendation to an entire area. So it had to be generic enough where it covered the 95 percentile. That's what soil testing was built for. It was not built for precision. So I'm going to tell you, I have my own soil testing lab. I love soil testing, but there's limitations, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. But it's accurate, and accurate is okay if we understand what's the range of accuracy. And are we at 95 percentile because we're covering the high end, which means there's economic opportunity down here, and there's also economic opportunity up here. Do we want to maybe get a little risky and play in that? But the easy buttons, if you don't have to put in data, they're using a generic model, pulling generic data in. And so just know that you're probably very accurate, but you're not precise. The more data you have, which goes back to tomorrow's talk, come tomorrow, and we'll get into the precision that can come from site-specific data. I'm plugging into that, right? This is a real thing in the tech world for folks that are selling. Man, when I have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I mean, I will beat the crud out of stuff that was never meant to be hammered in because that's what I hold. If I have an NDVI sensor, I'm going to tell you NDVI does everything. It doesn't. It's related to everything because it's biomass. NDVI is equal to biomass. How many things affect biomass? They all do. Every single one. If I have an EC sensor that senses texture, it is the hammer, and I'm going to apply it to everything, right? This is what we've got to break down when we start thinking about tech and how does it apply and where does it apply to? This is my contact. I wanted to leave a couple minutes, and I was going to scare Hammy. I do a talk that's a one-slide talk. I didn't. But I wanted to open it up a few moments for questions and stuff, but here's all my contact information. If you forget my name, which I don't expect you to remember, just Google OSU MPK. And yes, I do have the Twitters and the X's and all those.
You delivered on entertaining as well as educating as we expected. Thank you, Brian. Edutainment. I like it. Any questions in the room currently for Brian? Okay, hold on.
They're not John.
We're not giving John the mic yet. I'm going to go to Edgar first because I didn't get to him earlier for Todd's question. So.
Very much enjoyed the presentation, Brian. Dr. Stan Barber from Purdue University, mechanistic investigation and nutrient dynamics in the soil. Can you comment about that research and its role in doing nutrient planning?
I'm honestly, I'd have to look it up. I've not looked into that recently. I'm going to have to dig into that one. Can you give me a synopsis?
Well, he's now passed. He's
Yeah.
Professor Emeritus passed, but
I've read it and I've forgotten. It's one of those things where I don't want to speak off the cuff because I'm not remembering exactly.
Well, fair enough. I guess from understanding the mechanisms of nutrient dynamics in the soil and plant uptake, using models to predict outcome.
Oh, yeah. So I love in fact, the Stanford equation is burned into my brain. And I can relate all nitrogen rate recommendations back to Stanford somehow, the Stanford equation, mechanistic mass balance. And that's the way they work. And I'm all on nitrogen management, I'm all about the mechanistic approach. And the models I feel that the best models are mechanistic, but the challenge with a mechanistic model is the data coming in creates a sensitivity. And so you have to have a lot of data to have a mechanistic model to be precise. You get more accurate with generalized values. And as long as you push your confidence interval high enough and get the 95 percentile, you're okay. And so that's what we see with a lot of the models is we make sure that we're putting the 95 percentile rate, even MRNT. Everybody familiar with that? MRNT, that's a corn belt, how they do it. It's a probabilistic model. It's at what point, what N rate did we get 95% of the yield? It doesn't matter what was downstream. It could have been 40% of the time we needed a third of that economic optimum rate, but the MRNT is that 95 percentile. And so I'm very much into that mode, but the data collection, the quality data collection creates challenges with the mechanistic approach. So then we deal with the imperialistic approach.
Okay, I think Tammy's got a question from online too.
Okay, I'll limit it to one. So it's an Alberta question, which why not?
Sure.
So we've seen through many years of field scale research projects that we can do a good job delineating zones based on EM38, Barris, organic matter, soil grid analysis, etc. I'm losing my breath. The problem is that even when we try to manage them differently with variable rate or whatever, we don't get the yield response. What approach do you take to building the models for each geographic location? What factors do you start with and how do you find your Liebig's minimums? Oh, he looked at his watch.
Minutes, oh my.
Yeah.
All right, so the question would be, we're making an assumption we should have a yield response when maybe we should be managing the efficiencies of the zones, and it's not a yield response and it's efficiency. So I would say first approach, let's not go back to a yield increase by zone. Let's look at our ROI by zone. So give me a profitability map. Am I making more profit per acre by doing that zone management? If I'm not, then I better back out and find out, okay, maybe I'm doing it wrong. And this is what I get with zones. I love and I hate zones. A zone is a small field, right? A field is a boundary made by a fence or political or a purchase line. A zone is a boundary built by a few variables. We've already acknowledged within this group that there's more than a few variables that drive the response. So one zone, we now build a zone, and do we have a zone for every individual input? Because we should, because inputs are not highly, or at least for our soils. I've got over 200,000 samples from the Mexico border to central Nebraska, looking at correlation analysis off a grid. And guess what? Nutrients aren't correlated spatially consistently. In every field, there's nutrients that are correlated, but it's not the same across fields in the magnitude. And so by zoning, now we're saying we're making smaller fields. Let's acknowledge that. So if I'm going to do zone right, I better have a zone for nitrogen, better have a zone for phosphorus, better have a zone for potassium, sulfur, and every one should have different drivers, because what drives my nitrogen does not drive my phosphorus, does not drive my potassium, does not drive my sulfur, does not drive my planting rate, because every one of those inputs have different variables driving them. And so the answer is it's hard, and there are no answers. It's hard to do all that because the data coming in. Go right ahead.
Can I just say that if there are no answers, that was a long answer for no answer?
So this is what I love to do with audiences. It's right on the nose. Is that I travel a lot, so I'm all over the place. I'm not here to tell you how to do things. My take on these approaches is to kind of break down the stuff that's out there to make you think about, this one thing that he said has application, and maybe I'll tweak this. most of the stuff you're going to forget by tonight, especially after the social, I hope. But is there one thing that I said that triggered this thought? It's like, you know, that could apply to my ground, my system, my management strategy.